Boy, what a week for school this has been. Quite a lot going on. My historical research class, I want to start with that one today. Some really fascinating things there. So I'm actually now like I don't have extra external readings to do for the class anymore. So just focusing really hard on the research paper that I need to write for this class. So it's a 10-page research paper on economics in World War One. So as I got into my studies, as I've said in past videos, I started looking at like labor and how labor influenced things because obviously the men left to go fight the war, and so women were here predominantly and older men and things, but they made exceptions for farmers to stay and to fight because they needed food. And that kind of led me down this idea of how did food really influence the war? And really fascinating stuff. I found out, and this is something actually I had learned actually on my mission, that grocery stores started at this time. I forgot that it was around World War One that this happened. But before grocery stores came around, you had these general mercantile stores. If you ever watch an old show like Oh Brother, Where Art Thou, or other things where you come in, there's a clerk, you meet the clerk, they give you tell them what they want, they go get it off the shelf behind them and bring it to you. Kind of like how automotive shops you do stuff these days when you go buy parts. That was kind of everything was bought that way, and so uh, that started to change. There's actually, I don't know if you realize this, a little bit of a fun fact for you. The first grocery store in America, basically, the idea of the grocery chains took off in Memphis, Tennessee in 1917, I want to say is when it did. Uh, there was a gentleman, I think I mentioned this a little bit in the previous videos. A gentleman had an idea, went to his boss fired him for the idea, so he went out and did it himself. It started one of the first grocery chains in America, and it was called the Piggly Wiggly. Yeah, if you're familiar with Piggly Wiggly stores, they're not like huge stores today like Walmart and things, but Piggly Wiggly was the original grocery stores. The guy went to eat lunch for his break at this new type of restaurant that was around called a cafeteria. They're pretty popular still in the South. He went to this cafeteria. We just walk around and go, "Here's what I want. Here's what I want," and then people, it's there. You just pick it up and you go to one central location and buy it all. So you fill your tray and then go buy it at one location. Basically, this was kind of a new restaurant concept back then. He took this idea and thought we could sell groceries the same way and came up with the idea of the grocery store, basically. So some fun stuff there. Uh, there was a huge message during the war that food will win the war during World War One, and they made a huge thing about this. So that's where my research is really. I'm starting to kind of narrow down my research. So when you do historical research, you're oftentimes going to start with a question, a thought, something that you want to investigate or explore more. And as you dig into the information, you'll start to refine and narrow down what it is you're looking at. So I started with like economics in World War One. I went to labor and farming, and then started looking at the food and see how that dials down. So when doing historical research, you're digging deeper and deeper and deeper in the same place, just narrowing and narrowing and narrowing it down to where you get down to a spot where you can say, okay, this is what I can write my paper on. I've got enough resources. I've got primary sources, secondary sources, things to come together here basically, which is really cool because as I've looked into food, the normal diet of a standard American at that time was red meat, potatoes, sugary sweets, different things like that, pies, cakes, all that kind of stuff. And that was the main thing. The problem is bread. They had lots and lots of like bread and rolls and things. So a lot of wheat grain. The problem in the war is the average soldier needed to have a diet that consumed a little over 4,000 calories a day. So they had high demands to have calorie rich foods, things that will help them to have the energy to do things. Of course, back then they were starting to really emerge this idea of A calorie is a calorie is a calorie, which we've learned in today's modern science that that's not 100% true. Um, so if you think of like dieting, it's not, deficit of calories in versus calories out, and you just instantly lose weight. It's way more nuanced than that today. They've realized that the science was just starting back then. We've gotten much better at it today. Uh, but this meant to have the troops have the kind of calories that they needed to have the energy to fight the war. They had to use a lot of wheat overseas. Uh, and the problem is Europe was losing, because of the war, its capacity to grow as well as process wheat, because a lot of the fields were bombed out or turned into battlegrounds. Refineries, manufacturing plants were shut down because they didn't have employees to run it, or they were bombed. With all the bombing that happened between England and Germany, there was a lot of destruction. Russia, which supplied a huge amount of wheat to a lot of countries back then, because they had so much vast land, lots of opportunities to grow wheat, they couldn't grow it as much because, again, demands of the war, plus they couldn't ship it. They couldn't distribute it because of the blockades and problems during the war effort. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships off the coast to disrupt supply lines for Europe as well. So there was lots of disruption going on in the system. So America needed to grow their own wheat and ship it to Europe, basically, to help out with that, as well as coordinate things from South America and other places to get the wheat they needed. The Food Administration was created. It was by President Wilson. He had a enterprising mining guy named Herbert Hoover run the Food Administration. So his job was to coordinate all the food efforts and things. And it was interesting because when he got started, the Food Administration actually began not as a government entity, but as a kind of an executive order in a way. The president issued an order that created this idea of the Food Administration and gave Herbert Hoover an opportunity to have a job. But Congress hadn't got around to passing bills to fund it and make it a legit thing. So he basically just did huge marketing campaigns to get cultural ideas out there, and encourage volunteers, and just recruited a ton of women to help him to promote the message of food. So here's the challenge. America needed to take its food capacity as far as growing grains for wheat and dedicate most of it to go to the war, which meant we had to grow as much as we could, and which meant fertilizers and things, which was helpful to expand and improve yields and so forth. But also we had to lower consumption of wheat in America. So they started doing no wheat Wednesdays or things like that. You just thought that was some weird social media trend, motivation Mondays. Nope, no wheat Wednesdays, meatless Mondays. Those kinds of things were actually World War I concepts. So they had a whole day a week. You didn't eat any wheat. And then they lowered the wheat content of things ever since. So they started using other types of grains instead of wheat, like your buckwheat and other sources, as well as potato flour. So what are other things that we have readily available we could grind into flour and then substitute that in our wheat recipes to lower the wheat content, thus preserving wheat for the war efforts. Then, of course, don't let anything go to waste. Don't let your wheat, sit out or go bad. Use it up, store it, preserve it properly. Canning became a big deal. They needed to be able to ship food over, so canned goods, the old K rations we've heard about in the past, came about in World War I. So canned goods, this is where Campbell's soup, they took off because they would mass produce soup, and then they could ship it to the European nations and then hand them out. And these troops would carry soup cans in their backpacks and stuff, and then pull them out and use those little manual things to ratchet them open, and then they would cook it over a fire. So contained food that they could use over there that would have a stable shelf life helped the war effort quite a bit. That's where a lot of that came from, actually. World War I still today is affecting how we eat and buy food. A lot of vegetables that were seen as just extra stuff. You grow certain things to feed to your pigs or stuff like that. they actually encouraged people to eat more vegetables, eat more nutrient rich foods, fibery foods that we weren't eating a whole lot of before. Because that meant if you diversify all these different varieties of foods, then you have less reliance on meat, less reliance on wheat as well for your main staples. So even they got blacks involved in this. Eating there were certain foods that more blacks ate more of than anybody else, and they started to normalize. Guys, the blacks have the right idea. Eat these other foods. Eat cornbread instead of wheat bread. Eat other things because we can diversify our food options at home and grow more ourselves. Have a garden at your home was a big push to encourage more homegrown foods, because if you grow it yourself, you don't have to buy it. The less you buy, the more the big farmers can then supply the government with supplies to go overseas with. So it was really interesting how this changed. It became super patriotic to cook at home. Uh, Huge patriotism around this idea. In fact, they really utilized women and women's influence during the war to encourage this. So the kitchen, in a way, became part of the war theater. If you can cook at home, if you can preserve your foods at home, if you can do more homemaking type things, you're helping the war effort. You are helping us win the war. And so all of these ideas of homemaking and so forth, preserving your foods, even preserving your clothing, make your clothing last longer and things. So homemaking was seen as a huge effort to help win the war, because it shifted how the resources could be used for the war effort. So they even went so far as actually talking about how, making you feel guilty for making French women have to work in the fields during the war, while they're starving and struggling because you're too good to change your food habits. The other thing that happened actually was because they encouraged people to skip a meal, so like 2 meals a day became the norm, sometimes 1 meal a day, because if you cut down on the number of meals you eat, that left, again, more food opportunities for the people overseas. And so they actually use the idea of being skinny. This is where this originates from. The idea of skinny being patriotic emerged in World War I. So skinny was good because you weren't eating too much. If you were fat, you were basically eating too much, which meant you are selfish and not contributing to the war effort. So they weaponized fat, basically, which is so crazy to think about, but is kind of a misdirected way to think about it, honestly. But that was their anything to promote patriotism. How can we? It became less of a war of racism or things like that, and more of a war of righteous versus evil type concepts. How they framed a lot of things. So it was really interesting how they put that together. So it's been fun research. So I'm pulling all this together to create my paper with, basically, these different sources. In my my senior seminar, the religious studies class, we talked a lot about Jacob this week and his wives. It's really interesting how polygamy worked out. I started realizing this. When we think of polygamy, we think of Mormons. We also think of Old Testament prophets. Those tend to be the biggest cases, but it's interesting that the polygamy between 1800s Mormonism and the Old Testament prophets had very different originations and motivations. So polygamy was somewhat widespread in certain areas in the old world. Esau practiced it, in fact, but he practiced more of what we would call a bad form today of, hey, I want another wife. You're good looking. Just come be my wife now, and bring him on for his personal aggrandizement. Abraham actually got into polygamy because his wife wanted him to. So in the ancient world, it was important for women to have children. That was their major contribution. That elevated them in status, especially if they could give birth to sons who would continue the family wealth and things. So if you couldn't get pregnant, that was a bad thing. That actually kind of demoted women back then in the ancient world. And so one way to get around it is if you had a slave, you owned everything about that slave. And so you could say, well, I'm going to use my slave as a surrogate. You get them pregnant, and then that baby will be my baby, and then that will promote me. So That was a common idea, and that's what Sarah used. That was her logic in getting Abraham to have Hagar as a wife as well. So Jacob is in a similar boat as well. He does have sons from Leah, and then Rachel can't get pregnant, so Rachel gives her handmaid. Leah doesn't want to be outdone, and so gives her handmaid as well. And then Rachel eventually has kids last, and it's crazy how that works. But polygamy back then was solving the problem of infertility. Basically, that's how you did it. You needed a different womb, basically, and so that's it was a practical solution, is what they were doing basically back then. So really interesting that contrast that we see there. Jacob is quite the he's seen in a lot of ways as a trickster in the Bible. He did a um, I mean, he tricked people. He tricked Esau to get the birthright. He tricked his dad Isaac to get the birth blessings. He he kind of tricked his father-in-law Laban, even though Laban was like the ultimate trickster, tricking him back. But he met his match in Jacob, basically, and Jacob ended up winning those trickster comments and remarks. So it's been really interesting to look at these perspectives and ideas of how this came about, how did what are these stories and what happened, what motivated these women. So it's been fun to kind of get into like what was the thinking of these women? How did they think? How did they do things? Why did they do it? And I wish we had more on like Leah and Rachel. I mean, could you imagine? It's, Rachel, of course, is the desired sister. She's the one that Jacob wants to marry. And then on Rachel's wedding night, she spends the whole day having a great time, celebrated as the bride. It's a big momentous occasion for a woman to become a bride and to get married. And then on her wedding night, her dad says, nope, you're not going to do the wedding night thing. Leah is going to do that. So Leah actually is the one that gets married, to the consummation of the marriage happens with, basically. Jacob wakes up the next day and goes, hey, wait, what's up? This is not the woman that I was wanting to marry. What's going on? And Laban's like, oh, well, in our culture, we don't let the younger girls get married before the older girls. So you got to basically marry the older sister to get the younger sister. And Jacob's like, what? What are you talking about? Why did you not mention this before the moment, this moment? And so he says, I'll tell you what, you work for me for 7 more years, fulfill Leah, do the whole honeymoon, marriage stuff, get it all taken care of, and then you can marry Rachel after that. So he ended up with 2 wives. He ended up with a lot of children and things. So it's kind of a crazy. Neither, Jacob did not want polygamy. He got asked. He kind of got tricked into it, basically. So it's just crazy experience, but it'd be fascinating to see what did Leah think. I mean, was Leah in on this? Like, oh, hey, yeah, this is the only way I'm going to have a chance of getting married. Was Leah like, okay, Dad, this is awkward. I don't agree with this. But in fact, Rachel makes the comment later on when they're leaving Laban's area after Jacob had fulfilled the years of service, that her father kind of treated them like cattle, basically. So I wonder what Rachel thought. Did she know ahead of time that this was going to happen, or was it like a last minute thing that Laban did to switch them out on the wedding night? Or it'd be interesting to get into their perspectives of what did they think at that time also. It'd be really interesting. So in my interfaith class, the Bridging Religious Differences class, so we've kind of culminated with the mediation night we did last week. This week, a lot of it is reading. So there's a book that we have that is all about what are some of the problems and challenges that come up with mediation and trying to do interfaith work, basically. So it was interesting to see some examples of how it has failed. Sometimes people fail to plan properly when setting up good interfaith situations. There were many instances of people experiencing something they didn't even realize was happening. There's one example of a person who is leading a group of Jewish students in going to some Catholic churches. Well, in some of the more older versions of Catholicism, in those, they would bury the saints and bury the members they would entomb them in the cathedrals. Well, if you were a really strict Jewish person, and they had one person in their group that was very strict in their Jewish priestly ideas, they cannot be within so many feet of a dead body. And so this put them in risk of violating some of their core religious beliefs by being in this cathedral. And they didn't know that the dead people were in the cathedral until they were there. And the people had not thought about very strict Jewish rites in dealing with dead people. So it turned into this conundrum that they later solved it and worked it out. So, I mean, the moral of the story is you do your best to provide good resources and help bring people together. Sometimes you can't anticipate. So you have to still be adaptable to be really understanding of the people and what's going on in their life and what's important to them, and realize that they still have an important say in how the outcome of these types of situations are going to work. So if you try to go into a situation of, okay, I'll set this up to be a good interface situation, and you set it up by your standards without evaluating how are everybody going to think about this, then you're going to set yourself up for problems. And if you do, you need to be adaptable, willing to shift what you're doing and not be too dogmatic in how you have things set up. So that flexibility, that opportunity to work with people and understand where they're coming from is really important, as well as forgiveness. I think that's another part of this that doesn't directly come out, but forgiveness of realizing, oh, you tried to put together you had good intentions in putting this together, and it didn't work out all the way for unforeseen things. I will forgive you of, okay, let's just, work this out, seek forgiveness, seek harmony with each other. So for the offended and the offenders, whether they intentionally meant to or not, seek harmony in all that we do is really an important point of doing interfaith work and mediation too. How can we bring harmony? How can we pull people together to have a better positive experience and humanize each other and realize the valid points on both sides? It's the same idea that I've talked about in a lot of my scripture videos about how to find truth. You have to take your point of view and the other person's point of view and see it on an equal platform. When you can see them equally willing to accept or reject them both, then the truth starts to come out. This is part of what Joseph Smith talked about with the idea of proving contraries is where you discover truth. So that's in interfaith and mediation, it's the same thing. That principle of, I need to see them as equal. I need to see they have valid points, I have valid points, and we need to find the truth between the 2 points and seek that opportunity. And that's where it really helps to move us forward. So a fun week, really good stuff. I get to focus more efforts on my research papers, which is great. Looking forward to doing more of that. So I only have a couple weeks to get them researched and written as well. So I'm my Hagar one, I'm almost done with all the research. I'm going to start moving to writing on that one and refining it down. And I'm getting close on my World War I paper to get close to finishing the research. I've got a couple more articles to read and a book to read. And then I think I'll have enough information I can start to compile it better and write it out. So I'm getting close on my outline and things pulled together with that one. And hopefully we'll get there soon. So thanks for watching. Hope you enjoy these videos. Ask any questions from them as well. If you have further questions about what I'm talking about or what I'm learning in my classes. And we'll see you next week.